They say justice is blind. But Ezekiel Marsh had watched it turn its face away from people like him for decades. That's why he stopped believing in shouting, stopped believing in fairness, but he never stopped believing in proof. So he walked into court one more time, not for himself, but for the boy on trial. And when a white officer hit him, the court didn't know that Ezekiel's silence was his weapon. Can a man without a badge, without a voice, still bring the truth crashing down? If you believe in quiet strength and lasting justice, tap like, share this video, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories. Let's return to that courtroom. It was one of those mornings where nothing felt urgent. The courthouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that had settled into the walls over years of routine hearings and forgotten stories. In a small county courtroom lined with worn benches and coffee-stained folders, people sat where they always did. Lawyers half-checked their notes. A clerk stifled a yawn. No cameras, no noise. Just another Tuesday. At the defense table sat a teenage boy, barely 17, wrists shackled, shoulders tight. He didn't make eye contact with anyone, just kept his eyes down like he already knew the outcome. His name wasn't important to most people in the room. What mattered was that he was young black and accused of stealing a car. And in this courtroom, that was often all it took to set the tone. No one seemed to notice the older man sitting a few rows behind the boy. He didn't speak. He didn't fidget. He just waited, holding a smooth wooden cane in his left hand and a calm stillness in his eyes. His name was Ezekiel Marsh. 7'2", thin frame, dark coat buttoned to the collar. Most saw him as just another retired man who spent too much time hanging around courthouses like folks do when their days get long and quiet. No one asked why he was there. No one wondered what he might know. When the court called him as a witness, he stood slowly, his right knee stiff as he rose. He made his way up front with measured steps, leaning into the cane just enough to keep moving. Once seated, he was sworn in and answered the first few questions plainly. His voice was low, rough from age, but steady. He confirmed that he had been in the area the night of the incident, that he had seen a figure near the vehicle in question, that it had been late. Then came a question that changed everything. "Mr. Marsh, did you clearly see the defendant inside the vehicle?" Ezekiel paused, just a second too long. Then he looked up at the prosecutor, calm but firm. "No, ma'am. I saw someone near it. Could have been the boy. Could have been anyone. It was dark. Street light on that corner has been out for weeks." That silence again. A quiet shift ran through the room like the air had changed temperature. The prosecutor blinked, then glanced at the officer seated behind her. She tried again, voice sharper now. "But you signed a statement saying you identified him." Ezekiel didn't raise his voice. He didn't frown. He simply answered, "I signed something someone handed me, but those weren't my words, and they don't reflect what I saw." Behind the prosecution table, Officer Clint Rourke White, tall and already tense, stood abruptly and took 2 slow steps forward toward the wooden rail that separated the court from the witness stand. "You saying I made that up?" he said, flat and cold. Ezekiel turned toward him. "I'm saying I don't put boys in a cell if I can't be sure they belong there." That was when it happened. It was fast. No warning, no outburst. Rourke stepped forward and struck him across the face with an open palm. The sound cracked through the courtroom. A few people gasped. The bailiff jolted halfway out of his seat, but froze. The prosecutor dropped her pen. The defense attorney stood up too late to say a word. Ezekiel didn't fall. His head turned from the impact and he took a breath like he was steadying the rest of his body. He gripped the cane, held himself upright, and didn't respond. No words. No gesture. He looked straight ahead like the blow never came. And the judge. She slammed her gavel once. "Mr. Marsh," she said sharply, "this court will not tolerate interruptions." Not a word to the officer. Not even a glance. For a moment, no one moved. A few people shifted in their seats. One woman in the gallery looked down at her lap, pretending not to have seen what she saw. Ezekiel turned to leave the stand. He walked back to the bench he had been sitting on, slower this time, his hand brushing against the red mark rising on his cheek. He didn't speak, didn't look at anyone. Just sat, folded both hands over the top of his cane and stared at the floor. No one approached him. No one asked if he was all right. The room tried to move on, but that slap hadn't ended anything. In fact, it had just begun something no one in that courtroom was ready for. Because what they failed to see, what they dismissed as weakness, wasn't weakness at all. It was the silence of a man who came not to witness but to finish. No one stood up for him. Not the bailiff, not the attorneys, not the judge. And not a single soul in that courtroom broke the silence after the slap. It wasn't shock that held them still. It was something quieter, more familiar. The kind of silence that settles into places like that, not because nothing happened, but because things like that were never meant to be questioned. Ezekiel Marsh sat motionless, hands folded over his cane, his cheek slowly blooming red. He didn't raise it to his face. He didn't ask for help. He just sat there, eyes fixed ahead, while the room around him rearranged itself back to normal. A white court clerk passed by his bench, glanced down without slowing, and murmured so only he could hear, "You're lucky he didn't cuff you." Her tone was flat. No sarcasm, no surprise. Just the kind of statement that people say when they've already decided who deserves what. She walked away without waiting for a reply. Ezekiel didn't give her one. Across the aisle near the gallery, a young black girl clutched a crumpled tissue. She looked barely 10, her braids neatly tied with blue beads, eyes wide and unblinking. She stood without a sound, as if pulled by something she didn't fully understand, and began stepping toward him. In her small hand, the tissue stretched forward and offering an instinct. Her mother caught her wrist before she could reach the aisle. The motion was swift, firm, not cruel, just scared. The kind of fear passed down without needing to be explained. She shook her head once, sharp and silent, then pulled her daughter back to the bench. The tissue slipped from the child's hand and drifted to the floor. No one picked it up. Judge Drayton never looked up from her docket. She didn't need to. Without pausing, her page turning, her voice echoed across the room. "Mr. Marsh, another disruption and you'll be escorted out." Her tone wasn't angry. It was practiced. The same tone she probably used when warning cell phones to stay silent or scolding someone for parking in the wrong space. But here it landed with a different weight, the kind that doesn't raise its voice because it's never had to. Ezekiel didn't respond. He didn't even glance her way. A few rows down, a woman in a cream blazer reached to adjust her bag and kicked the cane that Ezekiel had rested beside his bench. It rolled a few inches across the polished floor. She looked down at it, frowned, then picked it up by 2 fingers, as if it were something unclean, and placed it on the opposite end of the bench. She sat down, crossed her legs, and stared ahead as if nothing had happened. Ezekiel didn't retrieve it. He didn't move at all. His eyes were on the boy. The teenager still sat in cuffs, shoulders caved in, face unreadable. He hadn't moved since Ezekiel left the stand. But Ezekiel saw him clearly. Not the outline of a defendant or a file number in a system that swallows boys whole. He saw the posture of someone already exhausted. The quiet slump of someone who understood too early what it meant to be invisible until someone needed someone to blame. Ezekiel had seen that posture before in reflections in photographs in the mirror after long nights that ended too quietly. He wasn't thinking about the sting on his cheek anymore. Not about the gavel. Not about the woman who moved his cane or the child who tried to reach him. He was thinking about the years. The long, slow, grinding years of being looked at and not seen. Of speaking and not being heard. Of entering rooms and knowing exactly which people had already decided what you were worth. He thought of bank lines that moved slower for him. Of doctors who assumed. Of neighbors who smiled with tight eyes. And now in a courtroom that had already passed judgment long before the trial began, it all came back. Not like a memory, but like a weight. And yet even as the boy sat across from him in silence, Ezekiel didn't feel pity. What he felt was recognition, because what hurt the most wasn't what had just happened. It was knowing that this moment wasn't new. It was knowing how many times it had happened before, and knowing deep down that if nothing changed, it would keep happening again. He looked at the boy the way a man might look at his younger self, still trapped in a place he once thought he could outgrow. And in that quiet gaze there was no bitterness, only the ache of knowing. And the knowing had lived in him for a very, very long time. The hallway outside the courtroom was cold, not from the air, but from the way the light hit the tile, sterile and sharp. Ezekiel moved down it alone. His steps were slow, deliberate, the weight of the cane now more than just physical. Each click on the floor echoed too loud for someone trying not to draw attention, but he didn't care, not anymore. He pushed open the bathroom door with his shoulder, stepped inside, and checked the stalls. Empty. The room smelled faintly of bleach and metal, like most public buildings where maintenance always outpaced compassion. He locked the door behind him, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The phone he pulled out wasn't new. The screen was cracked. The corners were chipped. But it worked. And it was ready. He pressed one number and waited. When the call connected, he didn't say hello, didn't explain. He just said what needed to be said. It happened. Courtroom 4. Go. Then he ended the call and slipped the phone back into his coat like it had never left. Outside the courthouse, a black SUV sat parked in the shade of a sycamore tree, its engine idle, its windows tinted dark enough to erase whoever sat behind them. But inside, everything was wide awake. Special Agent Darius Marsh sat in the passenger seat, hands folded, eyes fixed on the small monitor built into the dash. He was dressed in plain clothes, but his posture betrayed the discipline that came with years of federal work. His jaw was still, his breathing calm, but his fingers tapped against his knee like a drummer keeping time beneath a quiet song. The screen showed a live feed. It came from a tiny lens sewn into the seam of an old man's coat. A coat that had just been struck by a uniformed officer in front of a courtroom full of people who did nothing. He had seen enough. The agent in the driver's seat looked over. His voice was low but laced with urgency. "Is this the moment?" Darius didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the screen, watching as his father sat back down, blood on his cheek, silence in his bones. He nodded once, slow and firm. It always was. He pressed a button on his earpiece, then reached across his lap and opened a case. Inside were 3 badges, 6 files, and a plan that had taken over 2 years to assemble. A plan built on patience, on trust, on long nights and unanswered questions and quiet meetings behind doors that never should have opened. He gave the signal. 3 blocks away, another vehicle came to life. In an unmarked sedan, 2 agents checked their gear and locked their vests. A man with a briefcase stepped out of a coffee shop and took a left turn that would lead him not to his office, but to the security entrance of the courthouse. And across town, someone started typing a set of warrants into the federal system that had been pre-drafted, pre-approved, and sealed for a moment just like this. The moment had come, and Darius didn't smile. He didn't feel triumph. He felt the weight of timing, of knowing that justice was never about making noise, but about moving at the exact second when silence could no longer protect the wrong people. He remembered the night his father came to him. No anger, no urgency, just a simple statement across a kitchen table. It's time. Darius hadn't asked questions. He had just listened. And then he had begun. Surveillance. Witness interviews. Quiet visits to small towns with broken systems and bruised records. Not to break anyone, but to reveal, to expose, to hold up the mirror long enough so those hiding behind procedure had to face what was standing right in front of them. And now, with one phone call, all of it had come to focus. In courtroom 4, an officer had crossed a line. Not a new line, not the first. But this time, there were eyes watching, evidence recording, truth waiting. Darius looked up toward the courthouse steps. The building was old, familiar, stained by decades of decisions, dressed in legal robes, but not always in justice. Today it would hold something different. He straightened his collar, adjusted his cuffs, and opened the car door. This wasn't vengeance. It was the answer to a promise made long ago, and it had finally arrived. Long before the courtroom, long before the slap, long before the quiet man in the dark coat sat down beside the boy on trial. There was a time when Ezekiel Marsh believed in the law with the kind of faith people usually reserve for things like God or country. He had stood in front of classrooms filled with bright-eyed students, chalk in hand, coat sleeves rolled just above the wrist. He taught constitutional law at a small state university, the kind of place where change always came 10 years too late and left 5 years too early. He believed that teaching young people the structure of justice would lead to its evolution. He believed that truth once explained could not be ignored. Then came the semester, when 3 of his students, all black, were pulled from their dorms in the middle of the night. No warrants, no calls to family, just flashing lights and vague charges that vanished as soon as headlines cooled. Ezekiel went public. He wrote letters. He met with the dean. He stood before the board of trustees with printouts of student records and police reports that didn't add up. He quoted law and precedent and policy. And still, when the next semester began, his name was no longer on the course schedule. The official statement said restructuring. The truth was simpler. He had spoken too clearly, and in places like that, clarity was often punished. His wife, Claudine, was the steady one, a nurse for nearly 25 years, the kind of woman who knew how to keep a hand cool on a fevered forehead and a house full of love when the world outside offered none. She used to tease him about his lectures, saying he never knew when to stop talking. But when the job ended and the papers stopped coming, and the phone no longer rang, she never asked him to be anyone else. She only asked him to keep going. They had been married almost 40 years when she collapsed on the sidewalk just 2 blocks from their house. A stroke. The ambulance came quick, but the hospital she was rushed to was not the one her insurance covered. The ER nurse took one look at the address on her ID and said, "She will have to be transferred." By the time she arrived at the second hospital, the damage had spread. The doctors called it non-reversible. The word fell like a final period on a sentence he never agreed to end. After the funeral, Ezekiel stopped answering most calls. He sold the house, gave away most of what they owned, and disappeared from every place that used to know his name. But he did not vanish. He watched. He moved through small towns into forgotten courtrooms where justice was practiced more out of habit than conviction. He sat in the back pews, quiet, unnoticed. He observed how charges were read, how evidence was dismissed, how the color of skin shaped the speed of a ruling. He listened to what was said in whispers. He recorded names, dates, patterns. Over time, he filled notebooks, then hard drives, then secure files that only one person besides him could access. He wasn't trying to save himself. That time had passed. He was preparing the stage for someone else. Someone who could do what he no longer could. Someone who still had a badge, still had a title, still had the authority to make the system look at itself. That someone was his son. Darius had joined the FBI with a quiet fire in his chest. Ezekiel had warned him what it would mean. The cost, the code switching, the rooms that would call him sir but never brother. Darius said he knew, and he did. What Ezekiel gave him was not encouragement. It was a blueprint. He told him where to look, what to ask, who to watch. He gave him the structure and the silence and the strategy. And Darius built it into something larger than either of them. People thought Ezekiel's silence meant surrender. But silence can be its own kind of discipline, a decision to wait, to gather, to outlast. Every time he held his tongue in those courtrooms, he wasn't walking away from justice. He was walking toward it. Now, as he sat inside a courtroom that once again tried to erase his voice, Ezekiel did not feel defeated. He felt ready, because silence was never his weakness. It was his weapon. And somewhere across the room, a boy still sat in chains, unaware that the quiet man watching him had already opened a door no one could close. The courtroom had settled into the kind of silence that wasn't quiet at all. It buzzed beneath the surface, charged by the slap that had passed without punishment and the quiet that followed it. Somewhere in that heavy stillness, the boy finally spoke. His voice cracked more from restraint than fear. "Please, I wasn't stealing. I was just—" He never finished the sentence. The prosecutor, a white woman in a slate-gray suit, snapped her folder closed and cut him off without hesitation. Another sob story. "We have heard enough from your kind." The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected them to. She didn't flinch after saying them, didn't look at the judge for permission or apology, just turned her back on the boy like she was already walking toward the verdict. Ezekiel stirred. Not dramatically, not even noticeably, except to those who were watching him closely. His hand shifted on his cane. His body turned just slightly toward the bench, the kind of movement that hinted he might stand, that he might speak. Judge Drayton didn't wait for him to try. Her voice sliced through the room like a blade. "You are one word away from being removed, Mr. Marsh." There was no discussion, no hesitation. No acknowledgement that what had just been said by the prosecutor might have been cruel or biased or unacceptable. Only control. Only enforcement. Ezekiel said nothing. His hand returned to stillness. But Officer Rourke had been watching him too. He leaned forward in his seat with a smirk stretched across his face like he had just seen a dog try to bark through a muzzle. "Told you? Old men like you need to stay in your rocking chairs." That time the room responded. A few chuckled. a sharp laugh near the back. Even the bailiff smiled, although he quickly masked it with a cough. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. It echoed more than the boy's voice had. It lingered longer than the prosecutor's cruelty. And in that moment, Ezekiel looked at the boy again, not the cuffs, not the bowed head. He looked at the shoulders, the curve of them, the way they tried to hold still but trembled just slightly. He looked at the boy's eyes locked on the floor, not in shame, but in the kind of quiet people learn when they realize no one is coming. And something in Ezekiel shifted. Not anger, not urgency. It was recognition. The boy could have been him 50 years ago in a different courtroom with a different judge, but the same silence, the same assumption, the same loneliness. And Ezekiel knew what it meant to be surrounded by people who saw you but never once tried to understand you, who heard your voice and already decided they were done listening. He looked around the room, at the judge, at the officer, at the people who had turned injustice into routine. And then he did something so small no one noticed. He reached inside his coat. His fingers moved slowly, not from fear, but from something more deliberate. The movement was careful, intentional, practiced. And as the laughter died down, as the next witness was being prepared, Ezekiel pressed a button no one could see. His thumb settled on it with a kind of tenderness, like someone opening a letter they had waited a lifetime to send. "Forgive me, son." He whispered it, not loud enough for anyone to hear. "You shouldn't have to fight this alone." And just like that, the courtroom that thought it was in control had already started to unravel. They just didn't know it yet. The doors didn't slam open. They didn't have to. They swung wide with a quiet authority, like they knew the room inside had already said too much. And when the figure stepped in, no one needed to ask who he was. They felt it. In the way he moved. In the stillness that followed him. Tall. Composed. Wearing a dark suit that didn't need to impress anyone. His steps were steady, shoulders squared. Gaze locked straight ahead. He did not hesitate. Did not glance to the sides. He walked down the center aisle like a man who had already read the ending and was just here to turn the page. When he reached the front of the room, he stopped. His hand moved to the inside of his jacket and came out holding a leather badge case. He opened it with a flick of the wrist and spoke without raising his voice. "Special Agent Marsh, FBI Internal Affairs. We are intervening under federal authority." The room did not gasp. It just went quiet. Real quiet. The kind that sinks into the walls and makes every breath feel heavier. Judge Drayton blinked. The color had drained from her face, but her lips moved, trying to shape something resembling control. "Agent Marsh, this is a mistake. There must be some misunderstanding." Darius didn't even look at her. His eyes were on Officer Rourke. "You assaulted a federal witness." He took a single step forward, the silence stretching with him. "That witness is my father." Rourke froze. Not out of fear, at least not right away, but out of calculation. His jaw shifted slightly. His eyes darted toward the judge, then to the prosecutor, and back to Darius. For a man who thought himself untouchable, the ground had just gone soft beneath his feet. Darius didn't move again. He didn't need to. He let the words land and sit there unbothered by the weight they carried. The man you struck. The man you humiliated. The man you ignored because he looked like someone you didn't have to answer to. That man had just become the one thing you could not touch. Judge Drayton tried again, but her voice cracked. "This is highly irregular. There are procedures. I have not been notified of any motion or—" Darius turned toward her. His expression didn't change. His voice didn't rise. "Your mistake is assuming you are not accountable." He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply said it like it was already written into the record. The court reporter, who had barely looked up all morning, was now typing every word with hands that trembled slightly at the keys. No one else spoke. The prosecutor stood, frozen lips parted but silent. The bailiff lowered his gaze. Even the spectators, some of whom had laughed minutes ago, were still now faces, blank eyes wide, as if they were realizing too late that the rules they thought protected them were not the only rules in the room. Ezekiel didn't move. He sat exactly where he had been before, hands still resting on his cane, back straight, breath even. But behind the quiet of his face, something had stirred. Not pride. Something quieter, older. He had spent years laying brick after brick beneath his silence, building something only those with patience would ever see. And now the person he had prepared it for had walked through the doors not as a child needing protection, but as a man prepared to deliver it. Ezekiel's eyes didn't widen. but something behind them shifted. The kind of shift only a father feels when silence is no longer needed. And this time, no one had told him to be quiet. No one dared. The silence that filled the courtroom wasn't like before. It wasn't the silence of dismissal or exhaustion or ignorance. This one felt different. It was heavier, tighter, like someone had shut off the oxygen but left the lights on. And in that silence, everything shifted. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a truth too clear to deny. Ezekiel Marsh, the quiet man in the dark coat, had been telling the truth all along, and the son who bore his name had come to make sure it could finally be heard. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Darius reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sealed folder. He held it in both hands, not with ceremony, but with the steadiness of someone who knew exactly what it meant to open it. He laid it gently on the bench, just close enough for the judge to see. This investigation began 2 years ago. The man you dismissed. The one you struck. The one you told to be silent. He was never here just as a witness. He was working with us. Voluntarily. Relentlessly. Undercover. He opened the folder. Pages. Photos. Transcripts. He continued speaking, his tone calm, measured, almost too quiet for a room so full of noise that had just been silenced. 32 cases, all from this county and the 2 surrounding ones. All connected. All showing a consistent pattern of altered records, coerced statements, deleted footage, falsified charges. Some of the victims were juveniles. Others were elderly. Most were black. None had been believed. Ezekiel Marsh had sat in back rows and gallery seats for nearly 2 years. He posed as a neighbor, a distant uncle, a passerby. And every time he watched, he took notes, not just of the verdicts, but of the way people were treated before the verdicts ever arrived. He collected recordings. He kept files. And when people warned him to stop, he didn't. Darius reached into the case again and lifted a small black flash drive. On this, you will find audio recordings from multiple witnesses who claim they were threatened in this courtroom. Some were told they would lose custody of their children if they testified. Others were told to change their stories or face perjury charges. He placed the drive next to the folder. There are also video clips. One of them shows a police officer opening a file drawer and replacing a signed affidavit with a revised one. The video was taken inside your courthouse. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Then came the part that made the silence shift again. Officer Rourke. The name alone sent a ripple through the room. You were investigated 3 times by state-level departments. Each time the file was closed for lack of physical evidence of misconduct. Alleged excessive force, witness intimidation, disappearance of body cam footage. Every case stopped just short, until now. But behind those numbers stood a man who knew that data alone could not shake the silence. The slap was not just an assault. It was the first time we had direct, observable, unalterable proof of violent intent. He looked to his father, who had not flinched through the entire exchange. Ezekiel knew what it meant to be silent, and what it meant to be hit. He had endured both, not for his name, not even for his son, but because he understood that without that final bruise, without that one visible wound, the case would still be a question instead of a statement. He used his own body to finish a story no one wanted to write down. The judge had listened without blinking. Her hands were clasped tightly on the bench, knuckles pale. When she finally spoke, her voice was clipped, trembling just beneath the surface. "You are turning this courtroom into a circus." Darius looked at her, his eyes calm, his tone almost gentle. "No, ma'am. You have been running one for years, and now the tent is coming down." There was no applause, no outcry, just stillness, because for the first time the performance had stopped. And what was left behind was not a story, not a scene, not even a verdict. What was left was truth, and truth does not beg to be believed. It simply waits. And when it finally arrives, there is nowhere left to hide. The silence in the courtroom was thick. Not the kind of silence that waits for the next argument or the next ruling or even the next headline. This was the kind of silence that asked to be left alone. Then slowly Ezekiel Marsh stood. He didn't rise like a man ready to take the floor. He rose like someone who had carried something for too long and had finally decided to put it down. His cane pressed against the floor with a soft click, his hands steady but worn. The room didn't move. No one interrupted. Not even the judge. Ezekiel did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I don't usually ask to speak," he said softly, and something in his voice made even the people farthest in the back lean forward. "But I have something I need to say. Not as a witness, not as a victim, as a man. He paused, and when he did, the room leaned in with him. The last time I saw my wife alive, she was sitting in a folding chair in a hospital hallway. 5 hours. No one called her name. No one offered her water. They told me the system was busy, that emergencies had to be triaged, but I knew what it really meant. They looked at our zip code and decided we could wait. He swallowed gently, his gaze not fixed on any one person, but on the space between them all. I stayed silent that day, not because I didn't care, not because I didn't love her, but because I knew that if I shouted, they would hear my voice and not my meaning. They would see my anger and not my grief. His voice wavered for the first time, but it did not break. So I sat there, and I let her name disappear into the noise, and I have carried that moment in my chest every day since. He exhaled the sound barely audible, but now I see something different. He looked toward Darius just for a second. I see a world that might still hear something if it is spoken with enough quiet. Because sometimes when justice screams, people cover their ears, but when it whispers, they lean in. They listen. There was no sound in the room. Not a cough, not a breath, not even the soft shuffle of fabric or heels. Then someone in the gallery, a young clerk in a gray blazer, wiped her cheek. She didn't try to hide the tear, only blinked and let it fall. A man near the aisle, perhaps in his 60s, lowered his head and folded his hands in his lap. No one told them to react. No one gave permission. But something about the way Ezekiel stood there without rage, without demand, made it impossible not to look inward. He did not name names. He did not accuse. He did not ask for an apology. He simply gave them space to see themselves. And that more than any indictment was what changed the room. Because the truth is, most people do not wake up wanting to be cruel. But they learn to live with small silences. They walk past the pain of others and convince themselves it is not their place to stop. They tell themselves that silence is safe, that it is neutral, that it is nothing. Ezekiel Marsh had lived long enough to know silence is never nothing. It is always either protection or permission. And in that courtroom, without a single outburst or headline-ready line, he showed them what it looked like to reclaim it. When he sat down again, he did not sigh. He did not look to see if anyone was watching. He folded his hands over his cane the same way he had before, but this time something in the room had shifted. No one spoke. Not because they couldn't, but because they knew whatever came next would have to be better, more careful, more honest, more human. Ezekiel Marsh did not need to raise his voice. He had already said enough. And for once the world had stayed quiet long enough to hear him. He did not speak when the cuffs were tightened. There was no shouting, no protest, not even an attempt to explain. Officer Rourke kept his eyes forward as 2 federal agents walked him through the gallery past the judge's bench, past the pews where only hours earlier he had smirked and laughed without consequence. Now the room did not look at him with fear or hatred. They looked through him, the kind of looking people do when they have finally decided someone no longer belongs in the room. No one stood to defend him. No one raised a voice in outrage. The walls that had once shielded him had gone quiet, and that silence spoke louder than any sentence could. Behind the bench, Judge Drayton was still seated, though her robe no longer carried weight. A court administrator leaned down and whispered in her ear. She nodded once slowly, the color drained from her face, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She stood and exited through the side door without a word. Later that afternoon, the official announcement was released. Judge Helen Drayton and prosecutor Rachel Knox had been placed under federal review with immediate suspension, pending the outcome of the internal investigation. There were no interviews, no denials, only a line of text, standard procedure, temporary action, but everyone knew what it meant. The boy still seated at the defense table looked as if he had not heard the judge's gavel strike. His hands were still folded, his shoulders still stiff. He stared straight ahead as if waiting for someone to wake him up. Then his attorney leaned over and whispered something into his ear. And suddenly the boy began to cry. Not loud, not desperate, just tears that came from a place deeper than relief. The kind that come when the body realizes it does not have to keep fighting. Ezekiel stood beside him. He did not speak. He simply reached out and placed his hand gently over the boy's. The courtroom, though no longer officially in session, remained still. There were no speeches, no applause. Just the sound of a quiet victory barely visible but deeply felt. Outside, the press had gathered quickly. Cameras, microphones, dozens of questions being thrown into the wind, hoping one might be caught. Darius stepped up to the microphones, not as someone chasing headlines, but as someone already burdened by what would come next. "This is not the end," he said, "but it is the moment we stop pretending that justice is blind." His voice was calm, not triumphant, Not bitter, measured. This is where we admit the system has eyes, and that those eyes have often looked away. Today they were forced to look directly at themselves. He did not stay long. He answered a few questions, made no promises, offered no apologies. And then he stepped away, leaving the flash of cameras behind. As the crowd began to thin, a white court employee in his 50s stood beside a younger colleague. Neither had spoken during the entire proceedings. They had done their jobs, taken notes, moved papers, typed transcripts. Now the older man leaned slightly to the side and said in a low voice, almost like a confession meant only for the air, "This should have ended years ago." The other man did not respond, but he nodded. And for a long moment neither of them moved, because cracks do not always come with explosions. Sometimes they arrive slowly, a shift in pressure, a weakening in silence, a moment when someone dares to tell the truth and the room for once dares to hear it. Inside the courthouse, the chairs were empty. The gavel rested on its stand. The seal of the state still hung behind the bench unchanged, but something in the air was different now, not because justice had finally been done, but because for the first time it had been watched, and once seen it could not be unseen. And somewhere down the hallway beyond the cameras and the chaos, a quiet man paused for just a second, then kept walking. By the time the last microphone had gone quiet and the final camera lens began to shift toward another headline, Ezekiel Marsh had already disappeared through a side door that no one was watching. Moving not with urgency, but with the kind of quiet resolve only a man who had seen too much and waited too long could carry his cane, tapping softly against the forgotten tiles of a hallway that had never been meant for ceremony. He did not glance back. He did not need to. The truth he had carried was no longer his alone. Inside the courtroom, now emptied of noise, but still heavy with the weight of what had happened, a court clerk began the quiet work of restoring order, stacking files, resetting chairs, wiping down surfaces that just an hour before had witnessed a silence louder than anything ever shouted from a podium. As she moved toward the witness stand, her eye caught something unusual, a piece of paper folded once and left beneath the microphone where the old man had last stood, his presence already fading, but not forgotten. Curious, she picked it up, unfolded the soft creases with care, and read the message written in a hand that was both deliberate and unshaken. To those who struck me, thank you. You reminded me why justice must not sleep. To those who watched in silence, now is your time to speak. There was no heading, no signature, no demand for recognition, no plea for attention, just words, just a whisper on paper left where someone might find it, and in doing so be forced to sit with it in silence, the same kind of silence that had once protected injustice, but now threatened to undo it. She read it again, slower this time, and though no one saw her expression change something behind her eyes, softened not from pity or guilt, but from the deep discomfort of realization, the kind that doesn't scream, but settles in quietly and stays. The note was passed hand to hand, not with panic or urgency, but with a kind of reverence, as if each person who held it understood that they were not simply reading a message but receiving a responsibility. And while the building buzzed gently with that quiet ripple outside on the sidewalk, under a sky that had begun turning the soft amber of late afternoon, the boy finally caught up to him. The same boy who had once stood accused, who had been ready to carry a label that was never his to begin with, who had nearly been forgotten by a courtroom more invested in its routine than in his reality, now walked alongside the man who had changed everything by choosing not to raise his voice, but to remain standing. They did not speak at first. The older man walked with steady rhythm, his steps slow but firm, and the boy followed, unsure if he was allowed to say anything at all. Eventually, with a voice that still carried the hesitation of someone not yet used to being listened to, the boy asked what had already begun echoing beyond the courthouse walls, in whispers and wonderings and newsrooms, waiting to decide what kind of story this really was. "Are you a hero, sir?" Ezekiel stopped, not abruptly, but with the patience of someone who had learned that some questions deserve stillness before answers. He turned, looked at the boy, and rested his hand gently on his shoulder. Not to make a point, not to inspire, but to connect one human to another, one story to the next. No. Just a man who waited long enough. There was no applause, no headline screamed, no crowd gathered, but something in the air shifted as they continued walking side by side away from the courthouse and into the kind of evening light that does not announce itself but simply arrives, steady, golden, and quiet. Behind them, the building still stood, the windows still intact, the walls still white. But somewhere deep within its foundation, a crack had formed, not from rage or riot, but from one man's quiet refusal to disappear. And as Ezekiel Marsh walked into the horizon with no medals, no cameras, no banners bearing his name, only the weight of what he had done and the silence that had finally learned to listen, the shadow he left behind stretched long across the pavement, not as a mark of where he had been, but as a quiet reminder of what he had carried and what he chose to leave behind. If this story moved something in you even just for a moment, then maybe that silence we often carry has already started to shift. Because Cracks in a White Wall was never just about one man, one courtroom, or one verdict. It was about what happens when truth stops whispering and starts being heard. It was about dignity, without shouting courage, without armor, and the quiet strength it takes to stay standing when the world tells you to sit down. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we believe these moments matter, and we believe the people who live them or listen to them are the ones who can carry them forward. So, if you found meaning in this story, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and most of all, subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories, so you never miss the voices we lift, the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the ones that echo long after the noise is gone. Your support helps us create more stories like this, not for views but for memory, because sometimes all it takes is one voice to remind us who we really are, and that voice might just be yours.